It is good to be here with you this evening. I'm Cody Sanders. I'm the pastor of Old Cambridge Baptist Church in Harvard Square, just across the river, and I'm the American Baptist chaplain at Harvard and the advisor for LGBTQ affairs in the Office of Religious, Spiritual, and Ethical Life at MIT. And it's always a pleasure to be here with you at MCC Boston. And I spoke this morning to Jim Matulski, who said to send you his love. And that he misses you very much. Yeah. I'm sure not the weather. When Paul told me the worship theme for January and February was going to be refresh, making all things new, I was really intrigued by what you were doing with this theme. And I assumed, given that the last Sunday of this 2-month focus was my given Sunday to preach, that someone would have certainly taken this Revelation text already. It's where the phrase, "Behold, I make all things new," comes from. But when I asked Kevin, he said no one had preached on it, so I thought it'd be fitting to end this series with this text from Revelation. But I get the hesitancy to engage the book of Revelation. It can be problematic. I remember when I was growing up in a Southern Baptist context in South Carolina, every year around Halloween, we would gather all the youth into a couple of vans and drive over to a neighboring Baptist church where we would go through for about an hour or two this thing that they called a judgment house. You ever been to these things? No. Well, let me regale you with tales from the South. The judgment house went like this. You entered, and you entered the story of these teenagers, and you went through a few days in their life, and it became really obvious which ones were the good Christian teenagers and which ones were the kind of bad heathen teenagers, and they would make certain decisions that would send them on certain paths. And this whole time you're going through the church, and in each room you're encountering a different scene from the life of these teenagers. And at some point the good Christian teenagers make some choice to go to Bible study and for milkshakes or something, while the bad heathen teenagers go to a party and do drugs and get drunk, and then they get into a car, and then they have a car accident, and then you go outside the church, and there are some old cars that the church has gotten from a junkyard that they've arranged in the, like a crash, and there's an ambulance at the scene, and the teenagers are sort of sprawled all over the cars. And I always wondered, in this little town where I grew up, couldn't have had that many ambulances around, how we afforded to put one ambulance outside this church every night for 2 weeks for this little judgment house play, but we did. And so you went from there to the mock funeral, where the church had borrowed a casket from a nearby funeral home, and one of the teenagers was in the casket, and the family was all very distraught, and everyone was wishing that this person had another chance to accept Jesus and repent and all this sort of thing. And so you went to the next room, and that was the room where they portrayed hell, and had this Satan figure with this very distorted voice that they had manufactured, and all these little kind of demons that would interweave among you in the room. So that was the scary part, and then you would go into the sanctuary that they had sort of decorated with this gossamer and white flowing cloth everywhere, and Jesus, who would, I think, even maybe descend on some sort of ropes of some sort, and the good kids, of course, who had accepted Jesus would be there, embraced by Jesus in heaven. And then the last room you would go to would be the pastor's office, where you would get to make your decision to accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. So none of y'all did that at Halloween, huh? Oh, what were y'all doing? So I get that Revelation is a bit of a problematic text to deal with, because this was how I thought of Revelation for many years. It was the portrayal of this book of judgment and the end of times and things of that nature when I was growing up. And I think a lot of more progressive Christians, peace and justice type folk, like the ones I serve at Old Cambridge Baptist Church, and probably a lot of you too, have written off the book of Revelation because we're led to believe that its ultimate message is that there's going to be a day when there is a divine escape hatch that will open up above the earth, and an eschatological ejection of all of the good saved folks into a heavenly sweet by and by. It's the dominant portrayal of the book of Revelation in a lot of literature and film the last century or so. The reason we've often run from Revelation can be summed up in the scene from the 1980s when Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Interior, James Watt, was asked a question on environmental preservation for future generations as he was testifying before Congress, and he said, quote, "I don't know how many future generations we can count on before the Lord returns." And that was his reason for not dealing with the environmental issues that were arising at the time that have now reached a catastrophic point in our lives. This illustrates well the reason that many of us have avoided the book of Revelation, not to mention all of the ways that LGBTQIA people in particular have borne the brunt of this misapplied message of judgment. But sometimes it's helpful to read a troublesome text alongside another community that has read it with different eyes, from a different social location. So reread this text a bit with African-American New Testament scholar Brian Blunt. Blunt compares the way that John, the author of Revelation, employs his cosmic visions to propel his readers into hopeful action with the way that slaves in the U.S. drew upon the images of the spirituals for similar purposes. These are Blunt's words. Listen to this. Quote, "Both John and the writers of the spirituals employed their visions as weapons in a war of resistance. They unleashed them so as to unbind a people from their fear, a people who are assured of their standing and existence in the world to come or more likely to risk their standing in the present in order to secure their future. This, I believe, is what John and the slaves were doing. They were envisioning the future in the hope that their people would be emboldened by the vision that they saw of the future to paint that very vision into their present history, to hope, to endure, and ultimately to resist now in the present." And Blunt goes on to say, "This is not the language or imagery of an escapist people who look to otherworldly visions to drug out their historical realities. Just as John foresaw a new earth as well as a new heaven, the slaves believed that God's accomplishments in the heavenly realm could and would lead to liberation in the earthly one. This is why they could sing in images that talked about other worlds, but in their essence challenged the structures of this world, and even more important, beckoned their participation in that challenge." And we are not left behind in that vision of Revelation. The book calls on us to make an ethical choice. All throughout the book of Revelation, the image of Babylon is used. Maybe it's been a while since you've read Revelation. You're going to go home and want to reread it, though, after tonight, I hope. All throughout the book of Revelation, the language of Babylon is used. And whenever you see that word in the book of Revelation, say in your mind, what John is talking about here is Rome. Babylon is the code word for the empire, the Roman Empire of his day. And the choice, the ethical choice that John is presenting to his readers is one of a choice between the New Jerusalem, which we saw in this text, and we'll get to a little bit later, the New Jerusalem, or the rule of the empire on earth. New Testament scholar Rosling says that John was an astute critic of the insatiable appetites of the Roman Empire that led to injustices against humans and to devastations of the earth. And to read Revelation appropriately, we need to read it from below, from perspectives of those on the underside of the power dynamics of the present, those ravaged by the insatiable appetites of the empire, those, as Howard Thurman, right here at Boston University, said, those with their backs against the wall. In order for the book's imagery to make any sense in our present context, we must reread the apocalypse as an invitation to make an ethical choice about our orientation to the world. It's a drama that seeks to shake us out of our complacency with the status quo. And for a long time, Biblical scholars thought Revelation was probably written by and for a group of persecuted Christians, Christians who needed to speak in this kind of code language in order to pass around their literature of subversion to the Roman Empire. But more recently, scholars have thought that perhaps this isn't the case. That what really might be the case is that being a Christian at this point is a very late book. It's not one of the earlier books of the New Testament. It's one of the later books of the New Testament, written toward the end of the first century. At this point, it wasn't so terrible to be a Christian in the empire. Christianity hadn't become the religion of the empire yet. That wouldn't be for another couple of centuries. And it wouldn't have won you any popularity contests to be a Christian, but it wouldn't have been so bad at this point. And what John was really doing is writing to a group of Christians who were becoming comfortable with the empire, who were becoming complacent with the status quo and the comforts of their own imbrication within the empire's rule and reign. And this drama, this ethical drama, was meant to institute a choice in their hearts, a choice between the empire or the New Jerusalem, a choice that had real ethical here and now implications. And I think for you, for me, the last couple of years has been a pretty difficult time. One in which, in many ways, we have seen sort of dystopian and apocalyptic dramas acted out in our own country, government, apocalyptic nightmares that have been affecting the lives of immigrants and Muslims and LGBTQ people, people of lower socioeconomic statuses, etc. And it has presented to many of us a challenge, particularly to those of us, and here's where it gets a little touchy, those of us who might have grown complacent under the leadership of a different emperor, to use a metaphor, but still the emperor of a neoliberal empire. And this new era in which we have seen these apocalyptic nightmares acted out on our very present world stage has presented us with an ethical choice, to see our lives as complacent with the reign of the empire, or to see our lives in this kind of ethical drama pushing us toward a choice for the rule and reign of God in our midst, not in the by and by. And thinking about all of this in light of your month-long series on African American history that you've also been engaged in here, I was trying to decide what African American figure might be an appropriate conversation partner for understanding this text from the book of Revelation. And I figured that there had already been a lot of talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and Bayard Rustin. We have last year's Bayard Rustin Award winner here in the congregation, Rosa Parks, folks like that. So I got to thinking about who might be a fitting companion to interrogate the book of Revelation, and I settled on one name, a person whose writing I've been living with the past couple of months, and that's Octavia Butler. How many of you know the name Octavia Butler? So a couple of you. Good. It's exciting to introduce you to her work. Butler was born in 1947 in Pasadena, California, where her mother was a maid to wealthy families in Pasadena. Octavia would often accompany her to work when she went to clean these houses, entering through the back door. Her father was a shoe shiner who died when Octavia was only 7 years old. And Octavia dreamed of being a writer. And she was told by many people in her life, including some of her own family members, that little black girls couldn't grow up to be writers. Eventually, resisting those messages that she received from others, Octavia Butler became one of the central figures in the emergence of what is now kind of talked about as Afrofuturism, sort of a subgenre of science fiction. It's a genre at the intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. Ingrid LaFleur says of Afrofuturism, I generally define Afrofuturism as a way of imagining possible futures through a black cultural lens. I see Afrofuturism as a way to encourage experimentation, reimagine identities, and activate liberation. Butler made such profound contributions to sci-fi literature that she received not only the Nebula and Hugo Awards, which are the top honors in sci-fi literature, but she also was the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant. Butler was an incredible figure. 2017 New Yorker article about her prescient vision in the parable books, which is where this inspired reading from the Book of the Living came from today, says that in colorful diagrams, Butler extrapolated her vision of a near-future dystopia from what she read in the news, forecasting what kind of collapse might result if the forces of late-stage capitalism, climate change, mass incarceration, big pharma, gun violence, and the tech industry continued unhampered. Sounds like she's writing apocalyptic literature, doesn't it? There are two books that I really hope that you will take a look at sometime after tonight that I'm drawing from this evening in interrogating this text from Revelation. One is The Parable of the Sower, published in 1993. The other is The Parable of the Talents, published in 1998. And these two books are set in the near future. So Sower opens in the year 2024, and Talents opens in the year 2032. And the central figure of these books is a young black adolescent named Lauren Oya Olamina. And I want to read you one excerpt from the beginning of the second book, Parable of the Talents, that'll give you some sense of why I think these books are so prescient for us. So this is from the beginning of Parable of the Talents. This is a long quote. Listen to it. I have read that the period of upheaval that journalists have begun to refer to as the apocalypse, or more commonly, more bitterly, the pox, lasted from 2015 through 2030, a decade and a half of chaos. This is untrue. The pox has been a much longer torment. It began well before 2015, perhaps even before the turn of the millennium. It has not ended. I have also read that the pox was caused by accidentally coinciding climatic, economic, and sociological crises. It would be more honest to say that the pox was caused by our own refusal to deal with obvious problems in those areas. We caused the problems. Then we sat and watched as they grew into crises. I have heard people deny this, but I was born in 1970. I have seen enough to know that this is true. I have watched education become more a privilege of the rich than a basic necessity that it must be if civilization is to survive. I have watched as convenience, profit, and inertia excused greater and more dangerous environmental degradation. I have watched poverty, hunger, and disease become inevitable and to more and more people. Overall, the pox has had the effect of an installment plan World War III. This is the setting of the books. And incredibly, in 1998, when she wrote Parable of the Talents, she also wrote about the presidential candidate in this future dystopian America of 2032, who was sort of a strongman candidate, not opposed to stirring up violence. And his phrase in his campaign in this book from 1998 was "Make America Great Again." The prescience of Octavia Butler. She found writing the Parable series too depressing to continue and hit a writer's block with the Parable narrative after the first two books, and shifted to write a different text, and presumably one day returned to this story, but she died of a head injury at the age of 58 before returning to the series, so it only consists of the first two books. But all throughout these books, Butler's protagonist, Olamina, is shedding the Baptist tradition of her upbringing and writing verses to a collection she calls the Book of the Living, the scriptures for a new religion that she, this young black girl, is founding, named Earthseed. As one commentator put it in Butler's prognosis, humans survive through an intricate logic of interdependence. They're faced throughout this book with the ethical choices of their age, confronted by a very believable, an uncomfortably believable dystopia. And they come together to cultivate a community of resistance and resilience. It is, in many ways, to my mind, a modern-day book of Revelation. Barbara Rossing, who I quoted earlier, is a New Testament scholar who reads the book of Revelation ecologically. And she points out that in contrast to the fundamentalists' claims of rapture, that notion that we were all probably at some point sort of the brunt of as we were frightened into making some religious decisions. Rossing says that in contrast to fundamentalist claims of rapture, which of course is an idea that doesn't really even come from the book of Revelation, comes from 1 Thessalonians, she says Revelation culminates in what might be called a rapture in reverse. That is, instead of people going up, it is God who descends. Listen to these words from chapter 21 that Josiah read earlier. And I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. The divine will dwell with them as their God." Rossing says the whole book of Revelation leads up to this vision of God's descent to earth and the renewal of the world. Heaven is not mentioned again in the book of Revelation after these verses, and there's only one more chapter after these verses that we read today. A fact that is especially striking for a book in which heaven has been so central up to this time. The revelation given to John is that God is undertaking a cosmic mission to heal the world, not to destroy it. Even in such an apocalyptic book, one that has been used as a tool of fear and one that is so avoided by those who have seen its capacity to immobilize us from making change in our world today, even in a book like that, here in this text, 3 times in the verse 2, God is said to be with them. It is a portrayal of a new way for God to dwell among God's people. And rather than the faithful being taken away, the holy city comes down to earth. In an interview before her death, Butler was asked about these parable books and her plans for the next book. And she said this, "The odd thing about my books is, even though there is a lot of pessimism and bad feeling, there is always hope at the end of it. And it is not tacked on. It's something that grows out of the story, even when I don't want it to." So here tonight, as you end this series on making all things new, listen to these words from the book of Revelation and the book of the living once again. The voice of God only speaks twice in the book of Revelation, and both times that voice is portrayed saying the same thing. This is the verse where the voice of God is portrayed. And the one who is seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also, he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then God said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Belief initiates and guides action, or it does nothing. There is no end to what a living world will demand of you. as wind, as water, as fire, as life. God is both creative and destructive, demanding and yielding, sculptor and clay. God is infinite potential. God is change.